Alright, so in this lecture, we are going to look at the two forms of the Constitution, namely the written Constitution and the unwritten Constitution. Now, when we say a written Constitution and an unwritten Constitution, does this mean that the former is written and the latter is unwritten? Well, that's not the case here. In fact, both the written Constitution as well as the unwritten Constitution, both are written, with the exception of the written Constitution also being the codified Constitution. In other words, the provisions of the written Constitution have been codified into a single document. Which is not the case with the unwritten Constitution. Provisions here, as discussed in the last lecture, provisions here mean the content such as the preamble, schedules, the parts, articles, etc. And codified means being organized in a systematic manner. So we are trying to distinguish between a written Constitution and an unwritten Constitution. We understood that both are written, with the exception of the written Constitution also being the codified Constitution. So we understand that what does the provisions mean. Now we are trying to understand what does the term codified mean. To understand that, we will look at the four essential attributes of a state. For a country or for an entity to be called a state, it must have four attributes. It must satisfy four attributes. Attributes are the features. So the first attribute being the territory, as quite logically there cannot be a country without territory. The second being the population, as it is the people who make the state. The third being the government, as the population is organized under the government. And fourth being the sovereignty, but for sake of our better understanding, I have written independence here. So sovereignty, the supreme authority, and the final authority, above and beyond no legal power exists. Let's understand this better. We are trying to distinguish between a written Constitution and an unwritten Constitution. We understood that both are written, but the provisions of the written are codified, and we are trying to understand the term codified. For that, we are looking at the attributes of the state. We looked at the four attributes of the state, first being the territory, population, government, and the independence. Now we want to understand codified. Please pay attention. Nomads and gypsies can have no state. Therefore, it is important to define the territory first. Unless we define the territory, we cannot decide the people. So it is after defining the territory, within the confines of that territory, we consider its people. So which is what constitutes the population. So before defining the population or considering the population, it is important to decide the territory. Now, having defined the territory, we then consider the people, which constitute the population. Now, why are we considering the population? Because it is the population which constitutes the state. Alright, now few from the population form the government. So it is quite logical to first consider the territory and then the population, and then the government, because it is after the population came after defining the territory, And from that defined population, we were able to define the government. And such a government which is able to organize its population must be a sovereign government. So this order is systematic. This arrangement is logical. One follows from the previous. Here the four attributes have been systematically arranged and therefore are codified. And it is this what we mean by being codified, organized in a systematic manner. Now that we have understood that the difference between a written constitution and an unwritten constitution is that its provisions are codified, that the provisions of the written constitution are codified. Now let's examine if the Indian constitution is unwritten constitution or a written constitution by verifying if its provisions are codified or not. Well, if we look at the part 1, part 1 from article 1 to 4 deals with the territory. Now part 2 talks about the citizenship of the citizens, which is the population. Now having the citizenship of a country is like having the membership of an elite club. You get perks and privileges. At times, few obligations as well. Now perks and privileges under the Constitution have been given in the form of the rights. And rights under our Constitution have been given under the two heads, under the two parts. Part 3 consisting of the fundamental right, and part 4 consisting of the directive principles of state policy. Well, the fundamental rights are those for which at the time of independence the state had basically the fundamental rights are mainly the political rights, and these are the rights for which the state already had resources to provide with at the time of independence itself. Whereas the DPSPs, the directive principle of state policies, mainly the social and economic rights, are those rights which were then and are now beyond the state's limited resources, and therefore were left on the discretion of the state to provide for as and when the state gets the necessary resources. Let's understand this. We are discussing the rights here. Rights in the two forms of the right, fundamental rights and the directive principle of state policy. Fundamental rights are basically the political rights, whereas the DPSPs are mainly the social and economical rights. Where fundamental rights are whereas for fundamental rights, resources were available at the time of independence itself, but for DPSPs, even till now, the state cannot fulfill with the limited resources which it has. So they have been given in the form of directives to the state to provide for such fundamental rights as and when the state gets the necessary resources. Let's take an example. Article 17 abolishes untouchability. Well, to abolish untouchability untouchability, mostly it was the political will which was required. So it was abolished almost at the time of independence, whereas as far as eliminating poverty is concerned, it can be considered, eliminated with some tools such as universal basic income, say rupees 30,000 a month. But the question is, do we have the economical resources to provide for such universal basic income? The answer to that is a no. We cannot provide for such rights and therefore cannot alleviate the poverty. However, we intend to alleviate poverty. Therefore, we will try to provide for such rights as and when the resources permit. Now, after considering perks and privileges, few obligations have been added in the form of fundamental duties. So part 2, all the way, part 2, excuse me, the pen wasn't working. Part 2, all the way down to part 4a. From citizenship all the way to the fundamental duties. It talks about the population. Citizenship ship of the citizens is about the population. Fundamental rights, DPSPs, also about the population. And so is the fundamental duties. Now please pay attention to this last part. We are trying to examine if our constitution is organized or not, if it is codified or not. So we looked at the first part. First part discussed about the territory, and then the next of the parts, from part 2 all the way down to part 4a, we discussed the population. So if this arrangement is systematic, then the next in our discussion should be the government. And in fact, which is what the part 5 and part 6 talk about, and so on. Part 5 talks about the union government. Part 6 talks about the state government. Therefore, we can very safely conclude that the parts of the Constitution have been systematically organized. And the parts and having been systematically organized is what we mean by being codified. So the parts of the Constitution have been codified. So now we are able to deduce that the parts of the Constitution have been systematically organized. So this systematic arrangement is what we mean by being codified. So when the parts are codified, therefore we can say that the content of the Constitution is also codified, and it is the content by which we mean the provision. So if the provisions have been codified is the definition of the written constitution, then if this is what we call the written constitution, then Indian constitution is also a written constitution. Let's just quickly revise. we began our discussion with written constitution and So we began our discussion with written constitution and unwritten constitution. We understood that both are written, the written as well as the unwritten constitution. Both are written, but the provisions of the written constitution are also codified. We understood that the provision means the content such as the preamble, schedules, etc. We understood that we then understood the term codified. Codified means being systematically organized, and we took the example, to understand this, we took the example of the attributes of the state. We saw that the state has 4 attributes, and it is namely the territory, population, government, and the independence, and that too in this chronological order. So we understood that it is this chronological and logical order which is what we mean by systematic arrangement. So having understood the term being codified means systematic arrangement, we started investigating if the provisions of the Constitution are also codified or not. So we looked at the first part. Having looked at the first part, we understood that the first part talks about the territory. Then the next of the parts, starting from the part 2nd all the way down to part 4, discusses the population. And if this arrangement was to be systematized, if it was logical, then the next in the discussion should have been the government, and which is what the next of the parts of the Constitution were discussing, the government, and so on. So we were able to understand that the parts, being the content, are codified, and if such a constitution is written constitution, therefore Indian Constitution also is a written constitution. So thank you. And in the next lecture, we will try to understand the evolution of the Constitution and try to distinguish between an enacted Constitution and an evolved Constitution. Thank you.